As you see on the programme, what's on now is summary and emerging themes from previous sessions. At 10:30 we hope to discuss and agree the ballot paper, which you have before you, was distributed earlier, and later on we'll go on to some reflections by Tim O'Connor, chairman of the gathering. But in this introduction, I thought it was useful if I attempted to provide a summary of what happened yesterday, because yesterday there was a huge amount of material presented to convention members. There probably was a sense towards the end of the day that there hadn't been enough time to discuss everything that was presented. So my hope in providing a summary which is as faithful as I can be to what happened yesterday, while also trying to keep it brief, might provide a basis to start our reflection today. And we will also then have a contribution from Richard Humphreys to reply to one of the legal questions that arose in the course of yesterday. So what I will try to do now is basically follow the thread of the presentations yesterday, and I'll start briefly with talking about the presentation by Iseult Honohan. And Iseult was dealing with the issue of some principles that would underpin how we might think about this issue of voting rights. The question was who should have the right to vote and why? On what grounds should people be entitled to a say in a particular political arena? And she then dealt with sort of four principles that that are relevant in thinking about these matters. The all-contributing principle, which is essentially the idea of no taxation without representation. The all-affected principle, which is seeing that the right to vote as properly belonging to those who are affected by the laws and policies of a state. The all-subjected principle, which is talking about where people are seen as subject to government as the right for participation. And then the stakeholder principle, that those who have significant long-term, lifelong connections in a state or whose interests are bound up with the future good of that policy should have the right to vote. And she went through those different principles and how they would apply, and this was her conclusion. While there may not be grounds for an absolute right to vote for citizens abroad, there are some strong arguments for granting votes, at least to first-generation emigrants, in ways that do not swamp resident citizen votes. The strongest grounds for this seem to lie in two sets of arguments: the extent to which they share some of the subjection of resident citizens and the stake that they maintain in their country of citizenship over a lifetime through the interconnections with the future good of the polity. So that is, if you like, at the level of principle, how it applies to this idea of rights to vote. We then moved on to Theresa Reedy and certain international comparisons. And in summarising the external voting rights around the world, this is what she had to say. The voting rights of citizens are usually protected in national constitutions, but the specific details and practicalities of when and where someone can vote are often described in legislation. A small majority of the world's nations extend voting rights to their emigrant citizens. So a small majority so more than half of the world's nations extend voting rights to their emigrant citizens. And then drawing on evidence from research from 2007, which showed that there are 115 countries in the world with external voting rights, and just over 70 which do not enfranchise their citizens living outside the national territory. And the countries that do not allow their emigrant citizens to vote include the Republic of Ireland, Israel, and India. She then went on to look at, in the event of voting rights being provided, some of the mechanics of those: postal voting, in-person voting, proxy voting, and e-voting. And her conclusion was at the end, there are two questions that need to be addressed. Should voting rights be extended for Irish citizens living outside of the Republic of Ireland? And if answering yes to that question, the following then arises: are there any restrictions which should be imposed on the external voting rights? So these were our first two papers, the first one dealing with principles, the second one dealing with some of the practicality. We then moved on to two papers, first one based on a project in UCC called Emigre Project, a major exploration of current emigration from Ireland presented by Pierce McHenry, and looking at really some of the trends in emigration, and particularly acknowledging that there's been three waves of emigration in the last number of decades, the 1950s, the 1980s, and now, if you like, this current decade, and pointing out that obviously since 2008, the figures for annual emigration have increased substantially. And Pierce's research also dealt specifically with the issue of whether people both here in Ireland and people who have emigrated, what their attitude is towards voting rights. And this was his conclusion. In the case of voting rights in presidential elections, 79% of householders, whether there are emigrants in the household or not, and 85% of emigrants think there should be a right to vote. There is a fairly even split between those who think such a right should be limited in time, between 5 and 10 years, and those who think it should be granted for life. In the case of voting rights in general elections, 71% of householders in Ireland and 80% of emigrants think there should be a right to vote. A greater number of emigrants, 46%, think such a right should be a lifetime one, compared to 34% who think it should be limited in time. We then had a presentation from the CSO, which gave a long history, if you like, of statistics from the mid-1980s, but essentially showing that, after a long period of population decline from the 1980s to 1961, you then had a gradual increase in population. And there still continues to be an increase in population, but there has been very marked emigration in more recent years. And after that, we went to our global conversation. And the essence of that was these voices from the different countries that you saw. And they were, each of them, specifically reporting on the survey, that online survey that the convention had done, the net result of which was that a large majority of people were in favour of according rights to vote in presidential elections. And you also heard, obviously, their own personal commitment and personal testimony. At that point, we had almost reached lunch, and you had your first discussion. Thank you. I'm sorry about this. Is this not working? It is, yeah, okay. And this, just to refresh your memories, these are this was presented by David yesterday. This was where you had got to by yesterday lunchtime. I mean, I'm not going to go down and read out each of those bullet points, but this was what basically you had said. These were the arguments against providing voting rights for citizens resident outside the state. And then the votes in favour. These were what they were. And then finally, there was an issue of practicalities. And at the end of the last two bullet points, we're dealing with need more clarity on what it meant to be an Irish citizen. And in the course of the afternoon, we provided to you, we got some legal advice on that, a page here, 6 ways to be a citizen, which basically gives the detail of, what citizen obligation to be a citizen are and the rules associated with being an Irish citizen. The second issue there, do we actually need to amend the Constitution to make this change? That also generated a piece of legal advice which Richard Humphreys crafted in the course of a few hours yesterday afternoon, and which he was provided with you at the table yesterday, and which he will be elaborating on in a few minutes. So we then, moving on to the afternoon session, We had the advocates, Jenny McShannon and Brian Reynolds, advocating in favour, and Dr. Paul Connors advocating, providing a list of the issues that had arisen in the public submissions against this proposal. Now, I don't propose to go into the substance of those arguments now. I think you can all remember them. Some of them reflected some of the earlier papers, the principles, if you like, that Iseult Honohan had spelled out. And then later on, we went on to a specific section on Northern Ireland. And here we had three presentations, one by Colin Harvey, who spoke about the Good Friday Agreement, and particularly the implications, the constitutional implications arising from that, the changed constitutional and legal position. And this was his essential conclusion, that the Irish President occupies a constitutional position of symbolic and practical significance to all of those who are part of the Irish nation. It is a proposed constitutional change that is consistent with the guiding spirit of the Irish Constitution, the democratic orientation of the new Irish constitutionalism, and the fundamental principles of the agreements flowing from the peace process. That was Colin's core legal position, or legal advice, and he also made the point in his final contribution from the stage, advising the convention to keep a clear focus on the question we have been asked, i.e. the question of whether or not there should be constitutional change to permit votes in presidential elections, and not to go stray beyond that. The next paper was given by John Garry, and that was the paper which was analysing possible voting behaviour among citizens in Northern Ireland in an Irish presidential election. A survey conducted in 2009, directly after the election to the European Parliament, and the essence of his conclusions was this: the responses to the Republic of Ireland parties indicate that Northern Ireland citizens do not distinguish terribly much between Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour. The overall pattern to emerge is that the amount of people in Northern Ireland who are positively disposed to Sinn Féin is at least 3 times greater than the proportion who are likely to support any of the 3 main Republic of Ireland parties. And going on further to say, hence the overall picture to emerge from a particular table is that Protestants are very unlikely and equally unlikely to support Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael or Labour. Catholics are highly likely to support Sinn Féin. 2/3 would do so, compared to 1/5 for Fianna Fáil and less than 1/5 for Fine Gael and Labour. So that was, if you like, the essence of the summary, as best I can present them, of the range of papers that were given yesterday. And the final part of yesterday afternoon was the contribution from the 3 MLAs. And in both the case of Martin McGuinness and Alban McGuinness, they were strongly advocating for that the vote for Northern citizens to vote in presidential elections should be granted, whereas Stuart Dixon entered a reserve. He felt that he said he wasn't in favour of this at the moment, and his assertion was that it would perhaps undermine, in his view, the delicate balance of the settlement implicit in the Good Friday Agreement. Now that obviously view was disputed by both Martin and Alban, but that was Stuart's view, and it was a view which obviously it was important to put before the convention. So that's my best attempt to summarise a long and complex and difficult day yesterday. And one of the issues which remained, well, I wouldn't say unresolved, but which was a question yesterday, was this legal issue about whether or not there were constitutional changes required to enable, if we are to move towards votes, to give to votes outside the state, citizens outside the state, in presidential elections. And that is to which, that issue now is what Richard Humphreys will address. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. And I hope you don't mind me saying this is my first time to come to the convention, I'd just like to say, I, as a citizen, I've been very impressed with the decisions and reports that you've made so far and the common sense of your recommendations to date. Tom identified one question for me, which was, do you need to change the constitution if you want to extend voting rights in presidential elections? Now, I can only give you my opinion on that because there isn't a definitive court decision giving an answer, but I suppose my opinion is it depends on how far you want to go. There's certainly some leeway to give greater voting rights to immigrants, non-citizens outside the state, but there would be limits, and if you want to go beyond a certain point, you would need to change the constitution. Perhaps I should sit down now, but maybe I'll just very briefly summarise what I said in the paper yesterday. The current Act says you have to be ordinarily resident in the state if you want to be registered. Now, certain people are deemed to be resident in the state even though they're not. You're deemed to be resident in the state if you have left the state within the last 18 months but have the intention of coming back. So there is that year-and-a-half period for people on short absences. Also, diplomats are deemed to be resident in the state, even if they're not, and their spouses or civil partners. I think that's maybe a legitimate sort of a special category because an Irish embassy abroad, an Irish mission abroad is a form of Irish territory. Irish law to some extent applies to it. So they are in a special category. But apart from those are the only categories deemed to be resident in the state. There are other people who, if they're on temporary breaks from the state, continue to be ordinarily resident. I mean, when I'm ordinarily resident in Ireland even though I'm on holidays in England, for example. So short breaks, going for work abroad, holidays abroad, a tour of duty as a member of the Gardaí or the Defence Forces somewhere. Guards and Defence Forces get a postal vote, but they don't need to be deemed to be ordinarily resident because they are here anyway. They're only going temporarily. You can't get a postal vote if you're going on holidays. What leeway is there to extend the provisions? What the Constitution says is the only citizens who can vote in a presidential election are ones who can vote in a Dáil election. So there's no leeway to add in any extra category just for presidential elections in the Constitution as it stands. If you want to give greater rights to people outside the state to vote, if you want to do that by law without changing the Constitution, you have to give it for Dáil elections and presidential elections and referenda. You can't distinguish between those three categories under the Constitution as it stands, if that makes sense. It's sort of a three for one deal. That's all you can do under the law as it stands. If you want to make a distinction, and if you want to give some extra rights just for presidential elections, you do need to amend the Constitution. Now, how far could you go just by law? Presidential elections are linked to Dáil elections, which are linked to constituencies. Now, in my view, there has to be a link between for it to stand up in the Supreme Court, there has to be a link between the voter and the constituency. So I don't think under the Constitution as it stands, you could give a vote to somebody who had never lived in Ireland, or somebody who perhaps had lived here a very long time ago. By very long, I'm kind of personally thinking about 10 years would probably be on the wrong side of the line, but you know, it's a matter of opinion of what the Supreme Court might do. If you want to give a vote to somebody a citizen who never lived in Ireland, or a citizen who was here more than, say, 5+ years ago, the safest option would be to amend the Constitution. I think you'd be entering into serious legal risk of unconstitutionality to do that by law. So the final thing I'd say is in deciding whether you want to amend the Constitution or extend the rights, what sort of factors would you bear in mind? I suppose there are two particularly that come to my mind, apart from the ones that were, well, maybe some of the ones that were mentioned on the slide as well. Certain types of election have a qualitatively different impact on people in the state than people outside the state. And you know, my own personal view would be parliamentary elections, local elections and referenda would have very much a qualitatively different impact on persons in the state. And of course there are certain persons in the state who can't even vote in referenda, like British citizens, for example. And there was mentioned of the Good Friday Agreement and balancing both rights, and certainly, you know, that's an issue that should be looked at. If you were going to give votes to citizens outside the state, certainly the presidential election would be the one to look at because of the lesser impact compared to those other kinds of elections. That would be on the plus side. On the minus side, I think, you know, there's no getting away from the fact that some people think rights are like piped water. I'm not just talking about this case, but rights generally, human rights of any kind. They're like piped water. They just come free, or they used to be free anyway, and people can't get enough of it. Let's just keep them coming more and more and more. But the reality is, every time you create a new right, you create an obligation on somebody else to respect that right. And in the case of voting, if you create a right to vote, you dilute necessarily and unfortunately, but unavoidably, you dilute the right to vote of the person who already has the vote. So, again, it depends on the extent. With 3.1 million people, passport holders outside the state, there'd be a major dilution. The extent, the weight of that dilution vis-a-vis people here is a matter for judgment for yourselves. But you have to be prepared to say, because we may get the figures and we may know. I mean, there's no getting around it. We'll have opinion polls. We will know whether the citizens outside the state change the result. You have to be prepared to say, yes, we regard the principle of recognising citizens outside the state as sufficiently important that we think that, if people in the state, let's say, vote hypothetically for Michael D. Higgins, and then if we add in the people from all around the world, it's Sean Gallagher, we're prepared to say that, yes, that's an improvement. We think it should be Sean Gallagher, hypothetically, and we think that's an improvement on what we have at the moment. Now, it would involve a certain amount of generosity on our part and so on, but I just don't want anybody to be dodging that question. You have to face that question. Are you prepared to say, yes, we think a different result would be a good thing and a better thing than what we have at the moment? And I'm not passing judgment on that. I'm just wanting you to address it. So if there's any other questions, Tom, thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Richard. I mean, I suppose the really net point here is that in order to extend the voting rights to citizens outside the state, Richard is very clear it would need a constitutional amendment. I mean, that for me is the core message that you took, and then you had a lot of other things as well in towards the end. I think the most effective way to proceed, though, is to see whether there are questions from the floor, rather than go back into plenary, because to go back into round table, because I think we need to do this now as openly as possible. So, are there any questions, particularly to Richard? Firstly, Joanna, and then Deirdre.
Well, I have a question for Richard, because I know Richard has done a fair amount of work to do with the Good Friday Agreement, and I'm a former chair of the Good Friday Agreement Committee in the Oireachtas, and I'm still a member, and I have concerns. I mean, I think it's very unfortunate that there was no unionist voices here. The only way I heard it mentioned was by hearsay. And I just don't think that's good enough. And on the Good Friday Agreement Committee, all the MPs from the north of Ireland have attendance rights, and no unionist MP has ever attended. And, our president under the Constitution, his role is as President of the Republic of Ireland. And I think it's very important. In Article 3 of the Constitution, it says that, which is because of the Good Friday Agreement, it says that a united Ireland should be brought about only by peaceful means with the consent of the majority of the people democratically expressed in both jurisdictions in the island. And until then, the laws enacted by the Parliament established by this Constitution have the like in area and extent and application of the laws enacted by the Parliament that existed immediately. Well, the gist of it is basically the laws for this land, which the President promulgates, is for the Republic of Ireland. He's not the President, even though it might be the aspiration, he's not the President currently under our Constitution for the island of Ireland. It's for the Republic. And, if you go down this route, it is probably, in the way that the Good Friday Agreement Committee in the Oireachtas does at the moment, it's probably not going to involve the unionist community in the north. It's going to distance them further, and I don't think that that's a very wise approach, to be honest. The whole idea is it's supposed to be by consent. It's supposed to be inclusive, and we haven't had unionist voices here about what they think about it. So I just would be interested in Richard's views on that. How does he feel it in terms of the Good Friday Agreement? Whether it would be a progressive thing to extend the voting rights at this stage to Northern Ireland citizens.
Thanks, Joanna. I'm going to take two more comments, Deirdre and then Michelle, because we are going to have to come back into the ballot paper as soon as we can and try to finalise it. Deirdre, please.
Hi, Deirdre Donaghy. I just had a question for Richard, just to see if I'm understanding. Were you saying that if someone leaves, then for 18 months, essentially they can still vote, but I suppose with the proviso that they come back to actually physically cast their vote here? I'm not sure if I'm right in understanding that from what you said, because that would kind of, to a certain extent, deal with a lot of temporary absences, which were kind of a motivating factor.
Okay. Michelle, please.
Thank you, Michelle Mulhern. I'd like to support Joanna Tuffy and the concerns she's raised. I really think that for the purpose of this, it's unfortunate that the plight of our young Irish people who are being forced to immigrate to the four corners of the world has been tied up with the Northern Ireland issue, which to me is a special case in relation to citizenship, some of which Joanna has covered. I feel myself, having heard presentations, that what we heard in relation to the North was very lopsided and very one-sided, and at points bordering on misrepresentation of the vista or the picture or what people are contending with up there. I really welcome what Martin McGuinness had to say, which was, about the Fleadh, Ceol, na hÉireann in Derry, and how the sash was played and nobody blinked an eyelid and all the rest, and that sounds great. But we only have to think of the violence and devastation and destruction that took place on account of a flag in the North to know that you scratch beneath the surface and the peace process is very volatile. Equally, it's been suggested, particularly by Sinn Féin, I understand it's part of the nationalist agenda, Sinn Féin agenda. I know the DLP agreed that the vote might also be extended to people in the North, that, we're all progressive now, etc. But we had the Queen of England come to the Republic of Ireland, and she wasn't welcome by Sinn Féin as far as I'm concerned, which gave licence, I'm not blaming Sinn Féin per se, but gave licence to thugs on the street of our capital city, unprecedented security. And you can ask the Gardaí who were injured in the course of that thuggery, because I'm sure it's pretty fresh in their minds. So I think we're being pulled into a domestic situation in the North between two factions, which is historic, which, thank God, to date there has been great progress. The only person who touched on the situation was Stuart. And in fact, the two people up at the table, the other MLAs from the nationalist side, really didn't want to hear what he has to say. I think we have to tread very carefully. This is a domestic situation. I think that by virtue of the fact that the unionists choose not to come here, which I think speaks for itself about what they think about what we will or won't do with the Constitution. But I think going back to the Good Friday Agreement and the fact that the people of the Republic of Ireland voted to remove any suggested or implied claims under Article 2 and 3 that we were making to the North of Ireland in the interest of peace would mean that if we now turn around and say, well, actually, we're now going to say, well, everyone can have a vote, and that sounds very nice, and all the rest, when it may actually offend unionists to a level that we don't appreciate or understand, and we're still aggravate a very delicate peace process that's still in existence. I think we have to tread very carefully, and as I say, I think it's very unfortunate it's tied up with the plight of our young immigrants who have been having to leave the shore, and I don't think that we should be going there. I think there's institutions there already where dialogue is convened and facilitated between Catholics, Protestants, nationalists, unionists, and I think that's the way to go. And in due course, maybe we will have a 32-county Ireland, but I think it'll be more in the vein of young Northern Irish people or Northern Irish people who see themselves as Northern Irish and not particularly in an extreme position of saying, by hell or high water, we're going to have 32 counties. I don't think that's the way to go, and I think if anything, we shouldn't try to circumvent, which I think was happening here, particularly with Sinn Féin, the whole process that has taken place and the trust that was built up, which can be destroyed if we make the wrong decision politically here in the Republic.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I don't know whether it was Mary Lou who was. Could I say, Jerry, if it's okay, would Mary Lou speak? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to make, first of all, a point in respect of John Gary's presentation yesterday, and Richard sort of reiterated a point which I think is a dangerous point, and that is that you would take a decision whether or not to grant a voting right to a group of citizens based on how you think they might vote in an election. I just think that's the wrong way to come at it. And I don't really take your point, Richard, about other people having a vote diluting the democratic rights of others. I mean, if you think about it, if that had been the view in terms of granting the franchise to women, if you'd said, well, you don't know how these are going to vote, and of course it'll dilute the power of men, I think we can see how farcical and ludicrous that would be. I also want to say this, and I want to say it very clearly, because I think there was an unfortunate insinuation yesterday in Dr. Gary's presentation that somehow the granting of a voting right to citizens in the North was some kind of a win for Sinn Féin. Fact is, presidential elections are not characterised by being party political. That's not how people vote. And secondly, it's wrong to speculate as to how people might cast a vote. I'm not, frankly, all that bothered, although we will compete for votes, how citizens vote. But I do want them to have the right to vote. And I include unionists in that, as much as people who consider themselves to be nationalist or Republican. On the issue of the Good Friday Agreement, and specifically Michelle's and Joanna's contributions here this morning, let me say this. I'm a Dubliner. I've no familial connection with the North, didn't grow up there. I'm a Dub. As it happens, I'm in and out of the North very, very regularly. And I have a real sense that we in Southern society have not grasped, do not grasp, just how profound the change has been in the North. Absolutely a transformation of society. Michelle instances the issue around the flag, as Stuart did yesterday. Let's just say this so people are clear, that there are people in the North and in the South who oppose the peace process. They oppose the institutions. They oppose the equality provisions of the agreement. They are a minority on both sides, and sometimes they are disruptive. Of that, there is no doubt. But let me say this, that cannot be a rationale or a reason not to complete the project of the Good Friday Agreement.
Mary Lou, I think
that can't be an excuse. That can't be an excuse to deny equality to citizens. Let me give you an example, Caroline, and I will finish. I'll finish on this point because I think it's important. In the Jubilee year of the Queen, Belfast City Council very correctly passed provisions for funding and so on, for street parties and all of the rest of it, for unions for whom the British monarch is their head of state. That was the right thing to do. And bear in mind, Belfast City Council is a nationalist Republican council at this stage. That was the right thing to do because it was a simple, respectful acknowledgement and acceptance of who unionists are and of their British identity. I support, we have to do that.
Mary Lou, I think
but
we
to
have your
complete Good Friday, we equally need to recognise and a simple human acknowledgement of the identity of Irish nationalists. So granting the right to vote in a presidential election, far from scuppering Good Friday, far from it, is entirely consistent with it. It's a logical and respectful step. And the process is robust. And the naysayers and the people who cause trouble on the streets will not sink this ship.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Brona, and then we're not going to have any more contributions because we have to get to the ballot paper. Brona.
Thanks, Chairman. Brona Farrell. I just wanted to, there was a point brought up by Richard Humphreys there, and I think it's really...
More loudly.
It's really important that we focus on it again, because we've been told from the very start that our focus on this particular issue was purely for the presidential elections, that the votes were extended, the voting rights were extended. And now, in the course of about 5 minutes, that has actually been sort of slipped under the mat, because if what I hear from Richard is true, you can't just do it now for the presidential election. It has to include Dáil elections as well. So that actually might change the whole dynamic of this discussion, because originally we were told this was just at the moment purely on the presidential election side of things. But if this is opening a door to something that people didn't realise was part of the agenda, then we really need a little bit more time to have a think about that.
No, let me be very clear about this. We have been asked to discuss the right of whether or not to grant the right to citizens living outside the state in presidential elections. Even though a number of people have said in the course of this weekend that they think that right should be extended to general elections, We have not that. It is quite clear that there is a substantive and qualitative and principal difference between the two. And no, let me finish. And if we were to discuss the Dáil election, general elections, extending the right of citizens to general elections, we would need a much greater level of discussion. We are discussing here for this weekend the right for citizens outside to vote in presidential elections. What Richard has clarified is that if the principle of that right was to be acceded, then there would indeed be a requirement for a constitutional change. Is that clear? Richard, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Can I maybe just reply to all the contributions together, if that's okay? On Joanna's point, I mean, as you know, Joanna, I'm personally very much supportive of a united Ireland on the Good Friday Agreement model, namely a recognition of both identities. And it doesn't mean we have to sort of stop all progress and change until that morning breaks. There's plenty of things that reforms and changes and recognition of identities that can be done between now and then, and I'm certainly not encouraging the convention to be partitionist. I mean, any state has to, obviously, in many areas, limit itself to things within its own borders, but there are other respects where it may be possible to do something for its citizens outside its borders, and that's a matter for your own judgment. I mean, personally, I think the notion of balancing initiatives, keeping the balance, is good. I personally would see merit in, if you were to decide to give Irish citizens votes in presidential elections outside the state, you know, again, I personally would like to see that balanced with a right for British citizens in this state to vote in referenda, for example. And that would be in keeping with the spirit of the agreement, in my view. As far as unionist participation is concerned, I mean, unionists aren't going to vote in these elections if you do extend the right to vote outside the state, because under Irish law, citizenship of Ireland by birth is only an entitlement, it's not automatic, and to acquire the actual citizenship, you have to do an act that is limited to citizens. So by voting in an Irish election, a unionist would be becoming an Irish citizen. So on that basis, legally, they're not going to do it. Deirdre and the register. Deirdre, in terms of voters, there are two applications you have to make. You have to apply to be on the register, that's one thing. And if you don't get over that hurdle, you can't vote under any circumstances. So everybody, to vote anyway, whether in person or by post, you've got to make that application to be on the register. And you can stay on it for 18 months, as I said. If you want to avoid having to come back to Ireland, you've got to make a second application for a postal vote. And you may be able to do that. If you're in London, you get your employer to stamp the form and say you're likely to be absent due to work. So you may well be able to get the postal vote and use it for an election during that 18-month period. So I hope that answers your question. Michelle, well, look, the question of whether to do something for citizens in Northern Ireland or do something for emigrants in a more wide sense, that's a policy matter for yourselves. I wouldn't want to comment on it. I would just say, I mean, in fairness to Sinn Féin, obviously I don't speak for them, but I mean, they have engaged in quite a number of gestures to recognise the British identity as well, and you know that's something I think that should be encouraged for all parties, as have many other parties indeed. But you know, I'm thinking of Alex Maskey's two flags and so on. I mean, I'm not going to list them out, but you know, just in fairness, seeing as you did mention them. Mary Lou, well, look, Mary Lou, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. I'm certainly not arguing that you should make a decision based on how you think people are likely to vote. And that's why I said it was a hypothetical. I'm not engaging in the sort of party politics side of it or saying, well, you know, we shouldn't give people the vote because they might vote a particular way. What I'm saying is just from a sort of a cold, sort of clinical academic standpoint, you have to face the possibility, well, certainty at some stage, that persons outside, the citizens outside the state will vote in such a way that they constitute a critical mass that tips the balance between two candidates. It doesn't matter who the candidates are, but it is virtually certain that that will happen at some point. So if you're happy with that, that's fine. I just want people to be clear that that is something that there's no getting around. In terms of dilution, you know, I'm not saying dilution is a bad thing. There are many dilutions that are a good thing. The 1832 Ballot Act diluted the votes of the elite property-owning classes, not to in an attempt to endeavour to please Mary Lou, not to stir up hostility from some other quarter, but the abolition of the Seanad will dilute the votes of university graduates, for example, who have 2 votes at the moment, and afterwards they'll only have 1 in the Dáil. And that sort of dilution, to my mind, is a great thing. Don't feel obliged to agree with me on that. But the point I'm making to you is, I'm not using dilution as a pejorative term. I'm just using it as a factual term. If you have one group of voters and you then give the vote to some other group, especially a large group, you are simply diluting the votes of the existing voters. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is a matter of judgment, and you have to weigh that with the pros and cons of what it is you're trying to achieve. Bronagh, what I'm saying about the Dáil elections is, if you don't change the constitution, and if you just try to extend rights by law, by ordinary law, then you will have to do it on a 3-for-1 basis. Whatever change you make will also apply to the Dáil, and it will also apply to referenda, okay? And if you want to, that's under the current constitution as it stands today. If you want to change that, and if you want to say, we're not going to have a 3-for-1 deal, we'll just give an extra right for presidential elections that won't apply to the Dáil, you can do that, but you have to do it by amending the constitution. That's the point I'm making. Sorry if I wasn't clear. Tom, I hope that's okay, and I'm sorry I don't...
Thank you particularly. That's what I was trying to say, Bronagh. So, Richard, thanks very much for your help.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay.
Thanks a million.